I never thought moving into a quiet, gated community would turn into a daily battle for peace. It started with small things, notes on my door, strange stares at the mailbox, and a friendly reminder about my front lawn. But then the HOA president decided my property was his project. He fined me, harassed me, and even trespassed, all because I wouldn't comply. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. And when I finally pushed back, the entire neighborhood turned on me. So I had one question left. How far would they go to destroy me? When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, I thought I'd finally found the peace I'd worked so hard for. The streets were clean, the lawns perfectly trimmed, and every house looked like it belonged on the cover of a real estate magazine. It was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors waved from their driveways and the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and expensive perfume. After years of renting apartments where noise and chaos were part of daily life, this place felt like a reward. Quiet, structured, safe. My small white house sat at the edge of a cul-de-sac, shaded by 2 old oak trees. I spent my weekends repainting the porch, planting roses by the fence, and watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. For a while, it felt perfect. The HOA brochure had promised a harmonious, well-maintained community, and at first, that's exactly what I saw. The board president, Greg Thorne, even welcomed me personally. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing everyone answered to him. He smiled wide, talked about keeping standards high, and handed me a packet thicker than a college textbook, full of rules. I laughed it off at the time. I thought it was just part of living in an HOA. My neighbors seemed pleasant enough. Karen Miller, who lived across the street, was one of those people who seemed to know everything about everyone. Always cheerful, until she wasn't. She'd pop over with a plate of cookies one day and glare at me for parking too close to the curb the next. Still, I told myself every community had its quirks. But soon, small things began to feel off. A note appeared on my door one morning. Please repaint your mailbox to match community color guidelines. A few days later, another. Your garbage bins must not be visible from the street. Then came a warning about the height of my garden fence. Nothing serious, just nitpicking, but there was something unnerving about how quickly it all started. Neighbors began to watch. Conversations would stop when I walked by. The same people who used to wave now pretended not to see me. It was like some invisible line had been drawn, and I'd unknowingly crossed it. I tried to play along. I repainted the mailbox, tucked the bins behind the garage, even trimmed the fence. But the notices didn't stop. They escalated. Every week, a new one appeared, each signed by Greg Thorne. That's when I started to wonder, was this really about community standards, or was someone using the rules to make a point? I didn't know it yet, but the real problem wasn't the notes, or even the fines that would soon follow. It was the people behind them, the ones who believed they owned more than just their property. And in a place like Willow Creek, crossing the wrong person could turn your dream home into a battlefield. The first fine arrived in a plain white envelope, folded neatly, with my name written in careful, almost polite handwriting. Violation: mailbox paint not matching HOA color code. Fine, $75. At first, I laughed. I'd already repainted that mailbox twice, the exact same shade they listed in their own handbook. But when I called the HOA office, Greg Thorne's assistant told me, the board reviewed your color under direct sunlight and determined it was slightly off-tone. Slightly off-tone. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. I paid the fine, just to keep the peace. But the next week, another letter appeared, then another. Each one for something smaller, pettier, more absurd. My garden hose was visible from the street. My car tires had dirt accumulation inconsistent with community standards. I was even fined for leaving my recycling bin out an hour too early. On a day when it had been raining non-stop, started documenting everything. Dates, photos, videos. Each letter I received, I placed in a folder labeled HOA Madness. It grew thick quickly. Then came the first board meeting. I walked into the community center expecting a conversation, a chance to clear the air. Instead, it felt like a courtroom. Greg sat at the head of a long table, flanked by Karen and a few other board members who looked like they'd already made up their minds. He didn't even look up when I entered. You're here regarding repeated violations, he said, his voice flat. We take non-compliance very seriously. I tried to explain that I'd followed every instruction, matched every guideline, done everything they'd asked. But Karen leaned forward, her tone syrupy sweet. We understand you're new here, she said. Sometimes people who move from less regulated areas struggle to adapt. The room went silent. I could feel every pair of eyes judging me. Greg tapped his pen against the table. Consider this a warning, he said. Next time, the fines will double. That was the moment I stopped trying to fit in. After that meeting, everything changed. Neighbors who once smiled now turned away. The HOA patrol, yes, they actually called themselves that, started driving by my house more often. snapping pictures from their golf cart. I caught one of them crouched near my fence, measuring something. When I confronted him, he muttered, "Just standard compliance checks," and sped off. Then, one morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Mandatory property inspection. Scheduled. Non-compliant subject to daily fines. They wanted to inspect my house for potential violations, inside and out. I called Greg immediately. "You can't just enter my property," I said. He paused, his voice calm and smug. "You signed the agreement when you moved in. Refusing access can result in further penalties." That's when I started digging through the HOA bylaws myself. The document was full of vague language, carefully worded loopholes, and clauses that gave the board nearly unlimited power to fine or inspect. But buried deep on page 47, I found one line that changed everything. Inspections must be agreed upon in writing by the homeowner. They didn't have my signature, so I sent Greg an email, short, professional, and to the point. "I do not consent to any inspection of my home or property. Please refer to Article 8, Section 14 of the HOA Charter." The next day, my lawn was vandalized. Someone had sprayed white paint across my fence, spelling the words "rule breaker." The roses I'd planted were trampled. My mailbox, that infamous mailbox, was knocked clean off its post. I called the HOA, furious. Greg said, "That's unfortunate, but it's not an HOA matter. Maybe you should install cameras." I did. And that's when I finally saw who was behind it. At 2:14 a.m., my motion light flicked on. The footage showed Karen, the same Karen who served on the board, standing at my fence with a can of spray paint. She worked fast, looking over her shoulder, then darted back toward her driveway. I stared at the footage for a long time, half in disbelief, half in rage. The next morning, I printed the screenshots and brought them straight to Greg. He barely glanced at them. "Without clear video of her face," he said, "we can't confirm it's her." "But it is her," I snapped. "Her car's right there, her jacket. You can even see—" "Please lower your voice," he interrupted. "Accusing a board member of misconduct without proof is a serious offense." A week later, another fine appeared, this time for creating a hostile environment toward the HOA board. That's when I knew. They were closing ranks. The more I pushed back, the more they tightened their grip. A letter came threatening property lien if I didn't pay my growing list of fines. My water service was accidentally disconnected twice. One morning, I found my trash bins missing, the same ones I'd been fined for leaving out too early. Every move I made seemed to trigger another retaliation. I started recording everything, every phone call, every visit, every late-night patrol drive-by. I built a case, but it felt like shouting into a void. The HOA owned everything: the management company, the legal team, even the community newsletter. Then, one night, I caught Greg himself. I was sitting in my living room when I noticed movement outside, a flashlight sweeping across my side yard. I grabbed my phone and filmed as he walked along my fence line, clipboard in hand. The next day, I sent the footage to the HOA demanding an explanation. Their response? President Thorne was conducting an after-hours compliance check. No violation found. They'd twisted it into me being the problem. That's when something inside me snapped. If they wanted a fight, I was done playing by their rules. I filed a public records request with the county clerk's office and discovered something interesting. Greg had been cited twice before for zoning overreach in another HOA he managed. He'd even been forced to resign once after a harassment complaint. I also learned that Karen's husband was the one providing security patrols through a private contract the HOA funded, meaning they were paying themselves to harass me. That was my leverage. I started sharing the truth, quietly, carefully. I talked to a few neighbors who'd also been fined unfairly, one for having a slightly taller mailbox, another for putting up a seasonal wreath. I showed them my footage, the records, the lies. Slowly, people started to see it, and that's when Greg's friendly smile disappeared. He called an emergency board meeting to discuss my pattern of defamation. The letter said attendance was mandatory. When I arrived, the room was packed. Dozens of residents whispering, staring. Greg stood at the podium, a stack of papers in his hand. "This community," he said, "depends on unity and respect. Unfortunately, one homeowner has decided to spread misinformation, damage reputations, and disrupt our harmony." He looked straight at me. "For that reason, we are voting tonight to suspend certain privileges, including access to the community pool and facilities, pending further review." I could feel my pulse in my ears. I stood up, shaking, holding up the photo of Karen vandalizing my fence. "You want the truth? Here it is," I said. "Your board is corrupt. Your rules are a joke, and I have proof of everything." Gasps, murmurs. Someone in the back yelled, "Let her speak!" But Greg banged his gavel so hard it cracked the wood. "Order! This meeting is adjourned." As people filed out, Karen smirked. "Maybe next time," she whispered, "you'll learn who's really in charge here." That night, I sat in the dark, surrounded by stacks of letters, fines, and photos. They'd humiliated me. isolated me, and made me the villain in my own neighborhood. But what they didn't know was that I'd already taken the next step, the one that would expose everything they'd done. I'd found a way to turn their own rules against them, because if Greg and his little HOA army wanted a war, they were about to get one, and this time I wouldn't fight alone. The morning of the annual HOA meeting felt different. The air was heavy still, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. For weeks, I'd been preparing for this day, gathering every piece of evidence, every photo, every email that proved how Greg Thorne and his board had twisted the rules to serve themselves. My printer had barely survived the late nights, but I had what I needed, proof of their corruption, and a plan to expose it publicly. The HOA had called the meeting to restore order, but I had something else in mind. I arrived early, wearing the same calm expression I'd practiced in the mirror. Inside the community center, the air buzzed with whispers. Half the neighborhood had shown up, drawn by curiosity or fear. The other half, Greg's loyalists, sat near the front, arms crossed, waiting for their leader to speak. Greg stood behind the podium in his usual pressed navy suit, projecting confidence like a politician. Karen sat beside him, smiling that cold, perfect smile. "Thank you for joining us," Greg began, his voice echoing off the walls. "We're here to address ongoing disruptions caused by one homeowner's refusal to comply with community standards." Every head turned toward me. He paused for effect. "We value fairness here," he continued, "and fairness means rules apply to everyone, even those who believe they're above them." I stood slowly, holding the thick folder in my hands. My heart hammered, but my voice didn't shake. "You're absolutely right, Greg," I said. "Fairness means rules apply to everyone, including the board." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Greg's confident smile flickered. "I'm sorry," he said. "This isn't your turn to speak." "Oh, it's exactly my turn," I interrupted. "Because you and this board have spent months abusing the authority this community trusted you with." Karen scoffed. "This again? We've been more than patient with you." I ignored her and pulled a stack of documents from my folder, holding them up for everyone to see. "These are copies of the HOA's financial records. You've been using community funds to pay your husband's so-called security patrols. That's a conflict of interest, and it's illegal." Gasps spread through the room. Greg stepped forward, his face tightening. "Those payments were approved by you," I cut in, "and signed off by a board that includes your wife's best friend." I pointed directly at Karen. "Do you really want to keep pretending this is about lawn colors and mailboxes?" Karen's face flushed crimson. Greg raised his voice. "You've made serious accusations without context or authority." I walked toward the projector screen at the front of the room and plugged in my laptop. The room went dark except for the glow of the screen. "Fine," I said. "Let's add some context." The first video clip began to play, grainy security footage from my own cameras. It showed Karen, in her pink jacket, spray painting rule breaker across my fence in the middle of the night. Then running back toward her driveway, the crowd gasped louder this time. Someone whispered, "That's her." Greg's voice broke for the first time. "That doesn't prove anything." "Wait," I said, clicking to the next slide. "Here's her HOA-issued name badge, caught in the corner of the camera frame." A ripple of murmurs rolled through the room. I could feel the balance shifting. Greg turned to Karen. She looked pale now, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for a script that no longer existed. I took a breath, steady and cold. "You dismissed my complaint. You fined me for harassment. You said there was no proof. Well, here's the proof. And it's been emailed to every resident in this neighborhood and to the county compliance office. You could have heard a pin drop." Then from the back of the room, someone spoke. "She fined me too," a man said. "Said my blinds didn't match the exterior code." Another voice joined in. "They threatened to tow my car for being parked overnight." Then another. "They told me my wheelchair ramp violated aesthetic rules." The tide broke. Within minutes, the room filled with voices. Angry, fed-up voices. The quiet ones who'd been bullied, shamed, or fined into silence. Greg tried to regain control. He banged his gavel, shouting for order. "This meeting is adjourned," he yelled, but no one listened. I stepped closer to the podium, my voice low but clear. "You can try to shout over us, Greg, but the truth's already out. The county has the files. The management company has been copied. You can't bury this anymore." His face hardened. "You think this makes you a hero?" he sneered. "You think they'll take your side over mine?" I met his gaze. "I don't need them to take my side. I just need them to see yours." That line hung in the air like a blade. Then the door at the back of the room opened. Two county inspectors stepped inside, one holding a clipboard, the other a camera. "Greg Thorne?" one of them said. "We need to speak with you about some financial discrepancies and misuse of community funds." The room erupted again, this time with whispers and flashes of cell phone cameras. Greg's composure finally cracked. His confident smile vanished, replaced with the tight panic of a man who'd lost control. He turned toward me one last time. "You did this," he hissed. I didn't flinch. "No," I said. "You did this to yourself." The inspectors escorted him out. Karen followed, trying to whisper explanations that no one believed anymore. The board members left behind just sat there, stunned, like statues in a church after a storm. By the time the meeting ended, people were still talking, angry, relieved, alive in a way they hadn't been in months. They came up to me one by one, some apologizing for staying silent, others thanking me for standing up. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt free. Outside, the sun was setting over the rows of manicured lawns and perfect houses. For the first time, the place didn't look like a prison. It looked like a neighborhood again. But peace doesn't come easy, not in a place like Willow Creek. That night, I found one last envelope taped to my door. No HOA logo, no return address, just a single line written in thick black ink. You don't know who you're dealing with. I stared at it for a long time. The adrenaline was still in my veins, but the fear was gone. Because after everything they'd done, every trick and threat and humiliation, they'd forgotten something important. It wasn't alone anymore, and if Greg or his friends wanted to keep fighting, they'd find out exactly what happens when a whole neighborhood decides they've had enough. The week after the board meeting, Willow Creek Estates didn't feel the same, and that was a good thing. For the first time since I'd moved there, people weren't hiding behind closed doors or whispering about fines. They were talking, out in the open. The HOA's iron grip had cracked wide open and everyone could feel it. Greg Thorne was placed on administrative leave, pending a county investigation into financial misconduct. Within days, his lawyer released a short statement, the kind that tried to sound noble but reeked of guilt. Stepping back for the good of the community, it said. The news spread fast. Some neighbors cheered. Others shook their heads in disbelief that it had gone this far. Karen, meanwhile, suddenly put her house up for sale. The for sale sign appeared one morning, the same spot where she used to park her Tesla like a trophy. The listing said, "Quiet neighborhood, newly painted fence." I laughed when I saw it. The county's audit uncovered what we already knew. Greg had funneled thousands of dollars of HOA funds into his private security contract and consulting fees. The management company dropped the HOA within a week to protect its own reputation. And then something even more shocking happened. The residents, the same people who'd once ignored me, avoided me, even blamed me, called for a special election to dissolve the old board. It was standing room only at the vote. When Greg's name came up, every hand in the room rose in favor of removal. Every single one. The first few weeks after that were quiet, almost too quiet. People started reclaiming their yards. Kids played in the street again without Greg's safety patrol telling them to move. For the first time, I could leave my trash bins out without worrying about another fine taped to my door. I remember sitting on my porch one afternoon, watching the sun slip behind the oaks, when my new neighbor, Elise, walked over with a cup of lemonade. "You know," she said, "when all this started, I thought you were crazy for standing up to them." I smiled. "I thought so too," she laughed, shaking her head. "No one ever stood up to Greg, not once. We just lived with it. You didn't." That night, I looked around at the neighborhood, the neat lawns, the identical houses, the air that used to feel so suffocating, and realized how different it felt now. It wasn't perfect, but it finally felt alive. Then came the court date. Greg tried to negotiate his way out quietly. His attorney filed for dismissal, claiming procedural errors and personal vendettas, but the county had evidence, detailed, time-stamped, undeniable. Emails between Greg and Karen discussing fabricated violations. Invoices signed by Greg to himself under a fake company name. Bank statements linking HOA funds to his private accounts. When the evidence hit the courtroom screen, Greg's expression said everything. The man who once lorded over every mailbox, every lawn, every inch of this community suddenly looked small. He was fined, ordered to repay every dollar, and barred from serving on any HOA board again. Karen was issued community service for vandalism and a restraining order to keep her off my property. It didn't bring me joy, not the kind you'd expect. It brought peace, the kind that only comes when truth finally beats fear. The new board formed slowly. This time, it wasn't about control or appearances. It was about people, real people, who wanted to make things right. Elise became the new president. She promised transparency, open meetings, and one simple rule. If it doesn't make this community better, it doesn't belong in our rule book. They invited me to join, but I declined. I told them I'd had enough of HOA politics for a lifetime. Still, I attended the first few meetings just to see the change. The tone was different. No intimidation, no petty fines, no whispered threats. People laughed, debated, solved problems together. It was strange, almost surreal, to see the place that had once drained me of every ounce of patience, now becoming something good. A few months later, I walked past Greg's old house. It sat empty, the windows dark, a faint for sale sign half buried in overgrown grass. I stopped and stared for a while. For so long, that house had symbolized everything wrong with this neighborhood: power, arrogance, fear. But now it was just another house, another piece of property. Funny how quickly things change when the people stop being afraid. Still, there were scars. The damage Karen did to my fence never fully washed away. Even after I repainted it twice, I could still see faint white streaks in the wood if the light hit just right. At first, it bothered me. It felt like a reminder of what I'd gone through. But over time, I started to see it differently. Those faint marks became proof, not of what they did to me, but of what I survived. And maybe that's what this whole experience really was. Not about winning or revenge or proving someone wrong. It was about taking back the piece of myself that fear had stolen. About a year later, I received a letter from the new HOA board. It wasn't a fine, and it was an invitation. They wanted to dedicate a small garden at the entrance of the community as a reminder of resilience and unity. At the bottom of the letter, Elise had added a handwritten note. "You started something good here. Thank you." I went to the ceremony out of curiosity. It wasn't a big event, just a few dozen neighbors, kids running around, laughter echoing between the houses. Elise gave a short speech, talking about how every community has its flaws, but what defines it is how people face them together. Then she handed me a small bronze plaque to place at the foot of the new garden. It read, "For those who refuse to stay silent." I didn't know what to say. I just smiled, set it down, and let the moment speak for itself. Sometimes I still get messages from people online, strangers who somehow found the story through local news or HOA forums. They write things like, "I'm going through something similar," or "Your story gave me the courage to fight back." It's strange, the way a small neighborhood feud can ripple out like that, but maybe that's the lesson. It's never just about the mailbox or the paint color or the fence. It's about power. Who has it and who's brave enough to question it? One evening, months after everything had settled, I was sitting on my porch again, the same spot where all this started. The air was calm, warm, and still smelled faintly of roses. A delivery truck passed by, headlights washing over the street, and I noticed something that made me smile. A new family was moving into Karen's old house. They looked happy, hopeful, the kind of people who thought they were stepping into a peaceful, picture-perfect neighborhood. And for once, they actually were. The little girl waved to me as her parents unloaded boxes. I waved back. Maybe they'd never know what this place had been like before. Maybe they'd never understand what it cost to make it this way. But that was okay. That was the point. Because real peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's what's left after the storm passes. As the sun dipped low, I thought back to that first day. The smell of fresh paint, the tidy lawns, the friendly smiles that hid so much beneath. I remembered how naive I'd been, thinking a set of rules could keep a community perfect. Now I knew better. Perfection wasn't the goal. Integrity was. And sometimes, integrity looks like standing up alone until you realize you were never really alone at all. Before I went inside, I took one last look at the street. The mailboxes gleamed in the fading light, all painted slightly different shades. Some brighter, some duller, none exactly the same. No one cared anymore, and that was the best part. Peace doesn't come from control. It comes from freedom and the courage to fight for it when someone tries to take it away. So if you ever find yourself staring down an HOA that's gone too far, remember this: they can fine you, threaten you, try to break you, but they can't silence the truth. And sometimes one homeowner with the right evidence, the right timing, and the right resolve is enough to bring an entire system crashing down.